Thank you very much. Let me thank the organizing committee for inviting me. He said, if Basum is not presenting the lecture, Fati is presenting the lecture, it's the same group that is presenting it. Basum is my boss, actually. I trained with Basum 2000 to 2001. I don't have any conflict of interest. I'm supposed to present renal involvement in tropical diseases. This is the area view of my university. It's located in southwest Nigeria. And I'll run through this outline. A brief about definitions, and we talk about the epidemiology, and then we go on. Now, when we talk about tropical disease, we were being told yesterday that tropical disease does not necessarily connote infection, and that is true. But WHO definition recognizes that tropical disease encompasses all diseases that are peculiar or occur solely in the tropics, or commonly in the tropics. I mean, these days is a cosmopolitan world. There's no disease that's restricted to a particular region. Even Ebola, dengue, and all that, you get them even in developed countries now. But in practice, the term is often taken to refer to infectious diseases, most often parasitic diseases. So we're going to run through kidney involvement in some of these conditions, so I do not waste our time. As an overview, we know that the kidneys are involved in many parasitic infections, and these glomerulopathy or tubulopathy that are from parasites or from treatment of parasites are referred to as parasitic nephropathies. What is the magnitude? We do not know. Like many other things in Africa, we do not know the magnitude. But we believe that it may account for a much greater proportion of the patients that we get that present late in end-stage renal disease, and we will say the cause is what? Unknown. We have seen an upsurge in the prevalence of end-stage renal disease globally, but even in our local centers, we've observed something like the trend you've seen on the board. Now, all across Africa, if we look at the data that has been published, apart from hypertension, the second commonest cause of end-stage renal disease that has been reported has been chronic glomerulonephritis. Even the latest South African Renal Registry data that was published, GN accounted for 9.9%, while we had 32% of the patients that had unknown causes. So it still tells us that parasites may still contribute significantly to what we talk about. If we look at our local data, we see that those that have GN, the proportion of patients that have GN has increased over time. We are not saying the GN that they had may have been secondary to parasites alone, but definitely if they've had HIV will have been in a separate and independent category. Now, as an overview, the lesions this parasite could cause could be divided into three major ones: acute kidney injury, physical invasion of the urinary tract, or renal injury caused by immunologic changes or response to these parasites. For acute renal injury, most times we have from Plasmodium infection, from Leishmaniasis, and from babesiosis. For physical invasion of urinary tract, you have that in Schistosoma hematobium infection, you have that in filariasis, and you have that in Echinococcus granulosus infections. And for renal injury induced by host parasite immunologic reaction, you have it in virtually all parasites. And usually that is not immediate. It takes quite some time for that to develop. What is the distribution of these parasites? Majority of patients that have most Schistosoma hematobium infections are seen in Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa, as it were. Mansona is seen also in Africa, these same regions, but also in South America. But Japonicum is mainly confined to the Asian subcontinent. What about malaria? Malaria is present in virtually everywhere now. We were somewhere last night and somebody was very afraid that he could be bitten by mosquitoes. P. malariae is confined to mainly West Africa and East Africa, and most of the lesions that have been reported from P. malariae have been restricted to these regions. P. falciparum is more widespread. However, it's a commoner cause of renal lesion in the Asian subcontinent. We see P. falciparum very commonly in Africa as well, particularly in West Africa. And then hydatid cyst is seen all across Africa, particularly East, Central, and North Africa, and then South America. Filariasis is seen in Africa, is seen in Asia, and is seen in South America. So we have parasitic infections in all these regions. What is the immunology? We have host-parasite interactions. Parasites are recognized by the major histocompatibility complex, whether it's the parasite antigen or the metabolic antigen, whether excretory or secretory from the parasite. There's usually formation of antibodies and formation of immune complexes which get deposited in the kidneys and trigger inflammatory reaction. Of course, there's usually lymphocyte activation as well and clonal expansion. And of course, there's damage to resident cells within the kidneys. Now, what happens when these parasites get into the body? The parasites are recognized by the monocytes. And the monocytes respond through the release of interleukin-1, 6, 12, through Th1 response, and further release of interferon stimulates the monocytes again. Through the release of interleukin-2, the monocytes stimulate eosinophils to eliminate this parasite via antigen-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity. Or it could be a delayed response, Th2 response, which occurs with the release of interleukins 5 and 13, and eosinophil gets activated again, and the parasites are eliminated, as it were. Whether it's the Th1 response or Th2 response that we have, this could lead to activation of the B cells. And when the B cells are activated, that leads to release of immunoglobulins, IgM, IgG, IgA, as the case may be. And that also interacts with the antigen from circulating immune complexes, which trigger complement activation. And when you have complement activation, you have stimulation of the neutrophils, also with the B to eliminate the parasite, whether through complement-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity or through antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity. All this occurs in this patient. However, this occurs in all of us when we have infections. But when these infections now overwhelm the capacity of the body to eliminate the parasites, that is when we manifest symptoms. And what are the things that happen in such circumstances? There could be antigen variability. The antigen could change. We say it could be tegument antigen, it could be secretory antigen, it could be excretory antigen. It could change. So that could overwhelm the ability of the body to eliminate the parasite. There could be blinding of host cells to the parasite. There could be down regulation of the monocyte response. So the monocyte is unable to eliminate the parasite and triggers an inflammatory reaction. Or the antigen could come in excess, meaning it comes in a way as to overwhelm the capacity of the body to eliminate the parasite. And there could be induction of T suppressor cell clones. All this happens with different parasites. Like we could see some of the examples on this slide. Now, how do these patients manifest clinically? What do? They present with asymptomatic proteinuria in many cases. They could present with acute tubulointerstitial nephritis, acute glomerulonephritis, chronic GN, or some of them may be quiescent until very late when they present in end-stage renal disease. And that's why many of the time we report several proportion of our patients as having no known cause of the end-stage renal disease. All these parasitic diseases share some characteristics. What are these characteristics? Regression of acute insult. Most times, acute insults resolve within a short time. However, most of the chronic insults, particularly those induced by host immunological response, progress inexorably within a period of 3, 5, or 8 years to end-stage renal disease. And usually they have poor response to immunosuppressives and steroids. And there's lack of effect, once the immunologic damage is there, even when you eliminate the parasite, it does not alter the cause. The damage continues. Yeah, it's like a patient having CKD. You cannot reverse CKD. You only can manage progression of the CKD. These are some of the differences, but we'll go into that a little later. Malaria nephropathy. Somebody discussed malaria nephropathy with us yesterday, so I won't go into all the slides we have here. But we know that Africa accounts for approximately 90% of malaria cases. In Nigeria, 90% of the population live in areas with stable malaria. So that when you inform people that in spite of the fact that somebody has malaria, you could still go to work, they won't believe you. Meanwhile, in places where you have stable malaria, somebody can have malaria and go to work. Malaria nephropathy that is seen in either semi-immune or non-immune individuals could cause acute renal failure, particularly acute tubular necrosis. Sometimes they have massive hemoglobinuria and the rest. But they could have acute transient reversible glomerulonephritis. That's usually from falciparum infection. And they could have chronic, progressive, irreversible glomerulonephritis, what was described as quarter malaria nephropathy. I'll say a little more about that later. I don't think I should waste our time here, but to know that the problem we have from the parasite's release of the antigen could be through acute inflammation, hemodynamic instability, and could be through immune complex disease. Now, once this happens in malaria, there are three things that could happen. You could have increased mechanical fragility of the cells, endothelial adhesion or clumping. All this will lead to hemolysis, and that could cause problem. Or you could have activation of cytokines. Like we've said, you could have immune complex disease, whether through the release of cytokines or release of reactive oxygen species. Whichever one occurs, all this leads to impairment in tissue perfusion. Once you have impairment in tissue perfusion, what results is acute kidney injury. We call it acute renal failure then. There have been so many papers that have reported AKI in patients with malaria. So I won't waste our time on that. And GN is also, once it's reversible, it's good, because once you treat the malaria and the GN is reversible, the patient is free of any other problem. However, what I should say a little more about, because we were told yesterday that no such entity ever existed. That is the quarter malaria nephropathy. And that's why I'll say a little more about it. And what are the evidences? There are epidemiological evidences, experimental evidences, and clinical pathologic evidences that prove that quarter malaria nephropathy existed. What has changed? We do not know. Epidemiologically, we know that eradication of malaria from British Guiana, as recorded in Giglioli, clearly led to virtual absence of nephrotic syndrome, which tells us that whatever has been eliminated could contribute to the virtual absence of nephrotic syndrome. In an experimental form, when aortic monkeys were infected with malaria, they developed a nephritic illness similar to what is seen after 20 weeks in quarter malaria nephropathy. Of course, that type of experiment will not be allowed these days, but that was seen at that time. And then there's clinical pathologic. There's higher prevalence of P. malariae in children with nephrotic syndrome. This was independently documented in Nigeria, in Uganda, and I think in Kenya. And there's a characteristic histologic pattern that was seen. And the same thing was described by all these authors. So we couldn't say they were all confabulating. That entity existed. Whether it's still there today, I do not know. It's a primary disease of children, seen usually in those that are less than 8 years. Usually the parasite antigen is seen in 75% of cases, and it's P. malariae in most cases, not falciparum, not vivax. Poorly selective proteinuria in many of the cases, and response to steroid very, very poor. Now, it is rarely reported. So what has changed? We said there could be antigen variability. We said there could be so many things. Even our immune response pattern has changed. And now we're talking about genetic polymorphisms in different ways. So Many things could have changed the pattern of presentation or response to this agent. And now, people no longer have malaria that you remain untreated for long. Now, as soon as you have symptoms of malaria, they are put on combination therapy and all that. So, it's not like they have chronic nimbling illness that will induce an immunological reaction like is seen in those days. What is the gross histology? Progressive segmental glomerular sclerosis, irregular capillary wall thickening, inconspicuous cellular proliferation, granular or mixed fluorescence, and they see deposits of IgM, IgG, C3, and fibrin. In actual fact, they came together at that time and actually graded malaria nephropathy into 4. These are the 4 different grades, but I won't waste our time with that. Prognosis is usually poor, and majority of the patients progress to end-stage renal disease within 5 years. That's a picture of a grade 4 malaria nephropathy. You can see that there's virtually no cellular proliferation here. Here we have some generalized changes, some little proliferative changes, but more interstitial changes. What about filarial nephropathy? We have 3 major species of filaria that are pathogenic and will induce renal lesions: Bancrofti, Onchocerca volvulus, and Loa. We know that these worms inhabit the abdominal lymphatic system, particularly the Bancrofti, and causes elephantiasis. May rarely impair renal drainage as well, and could present with chyluria. And this can be diagnosed by urinalysis. Site of obstruction can be delineated using lymphangiography. I'm sure in these days we could use more modern equipment to do that. Filarial glomerulopathy could present in 3 major ways: acute nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, or they may present in renal failure. All these authors that we see here have documented at different times filarial-induced renal disease, either with Onchocerca volvulus or with Loa. And which histopathology has been reported? Minimal change disease in some of the cases, proliferative GN, mesangial capillary, FSGS, and more importantly, immune complexes are seen. IgG, IgA, IgM are found in glomeruli in almost all the cases. Ngu et al. In Cameroon, even though it's a very old study now, reported complement deposits in about 60% of these patients, and they were due to filarial antigen, O volvulus. And eosinophilic infiltration was very common in them. Antifilarial therapy in terms of treatment is beneficial in acute nephritic illness. Nephrotic syndrome is usually unresponsive to therapy, and progression to end-stage renal disease is very common. What about schistosomal nephropathy? That's the adult schistosoma worm that inhabits either the inferior ventricular vessels or inferior mesenteric vessels. They release their eggs usually into water or into stool. In the water, it hatches into the Meracidium larva that is taken up by a snail, different species of freshwater snail, and hatches into Saccharia larva that penetrates the skin of man. That's the life cycle of the worm. But what happens when this worm now gets into the man? It releases soluble egg antigen into circulation. This soluble egg antigen leads to granulomatous reaction, and that leads to fibrosis and could lead to diverse changes: lower urinary tract, bladder pathology, sandy patches, chronic cystitis, and terminally some of them could develop squamous cell carcinoma. It's also possible that they could release these antigens and they form antigen-antibody complexes like we've seen before, and this will result into glomerular deposits and will trigger inflammatory reaction. The antigens that trigger all these reactions in schistosomiasis are ill-defined. It's not known whether it's just the soluble egg antigen, the adult worm antigen, the tegument antigen, or schistosomal cathodic or anotic antigens, the glomeruli. All these have been found. So which one triggers a particular response is still not known. Antibodies also are released in different forms: tegument or gut of the adult worms, antibodies to them, or polysaccharide antigen of the gut origin. And there's usually polyclonal B cell activation, and they are circulating immune complexes of schistosoma, antigen, and antibodies. There are some HLA types that depict susceptibility to a particular histological type. For example, HLA-B5 is known to be present in those that have Mansonia plus intestinal polyposis. HLA-A1 and B5 are known to be prone to developing hepatic fibrosis, and HLA-A28 are known to be those that develop glomerular disease. For Schistosoma hematobium, the glomerulonephritis is usually reported in association with salmonella infection, and they usually will present with a proliferative lesion. Whereas Mansonia glomerulopathy occurs usually in association with hepatosplenic schistosomiasis. They usually have a heavy warm load. In 60% of cases, proteinuria is usually poorly selective. Hypertension is seen in about half of these patients, and circulating immune complexes and C3 are seen in biopsy specimen. There are other forms of histological types that have been reported: mesangial proliferative, mesangiocapillary, focal sclerosis, membranous GN, diffuse proliferative GN, and amyloidosis. Now, why do they have amyloidosis? Usually when the monocytes sense the presence of the parasite antigen, they release interleukin-1 and 6 that stimulates the hepatocyte. When this stimulates the hepatocyte releases amyloid A protein, AA protein, and this is engulfed, taken up again by the monocytes. However, when the infection now persists, the rate of stimulation will overwhelm the rate at which the monocytes could get this amyloid A protein off the circulation, and that means they get deposited within the kidneys and cause amyloidosis. Schistosoma nephropathy can also be classified, or has also been classified or staged. We have a class 1 that is just purely mesangial proliferative, a class 2 that is diffuse exudative, class 3 that is mesangiocapillary, even though that's subdivided into 3 subcategories, class 4 that is FSGS, class 5 that is amyloidosis, and class 6 that is cryoglobulinemic GN. The class 6 is usually seen in association with hepatitis C infection. And you agree with me that at the time this was described, we've not started mass screening for hepatitis C. So it's possible that most patients that were seen at that time with cryoglobulinemic GN that had schistosomiasis may have had their cryoglobulinemia from hepatitis C infection. That's a mesangial proliferative lesion, acute exudative lesion, mesangiocapillary, focal sclerosis, and then amyloid. How do we treat them? Usually we use schistosomal agent, particularly in acute illness. Ozamniquine, praziquantel, nirintazole, metronidazole, in those that are types 1-2 diseases. Concomitant infection with salmonella must be treated. Infection with hepatitis C or any other thing must be treated. But once they develop a glomerulopathy, all these agents will not be effective. And immunosuppressants are also not very effective. However, a third of these cases have spontaneous remission. What about trypanosomal nephropathy? We have 2 major species that are known to cause problems in man: Trypanosoma brucei gambiense and rhodesiense, and they are endemic in Africa. Cruzi is usually restricted to South America. The link with kidney disease for trypanosoma has been mostly experimental. People know, or it's been recorded, that there's reactivation of Chagas disease in renal transplant patients once they are commenced on immunosuppression. And presentation in some of these patients could be atypical. And there's been a mouse model. They infect a mouse with a particular species of trypanosoma, they come down with a renal lesion. So it's believed that it is linked. What do they present with usually? Proteinuria in some of the cases, but majority may be asymptomatic. And some of them could come down with acute renal failure. What type of histology has been reported in these cases? Immune-mediated GN, mesangial proliferative lesion, membranous proliferative lesion, and you have extensive granular deposits of C3 IgG1, IgG3 in the mesangium in some of these cases. What about leishmaniasis? There are 3 major forms: visceral, cutaneous, and mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. These are the infective agents, mainly common in Asia, Africa, Mediterranean, and South America. What is usually the presentation? Proteinuria in some of the cases, lymphocyturia in some of the cases, pyuria, and some of the time oliguria or renal failure, whether acute kidney injury or chronic renal failure. What type of histology has been reported in these cases? Acute TIN, tubulointerstitial nephritis, has been seen. Mesangial proliferative lesion has been seen. Amyloidosis has been reported. And we know that the drugs that are used in the management of this condition are also nephrotoxic. So we have drug-induced acute kidney injury in some of the patients. There could be spontaneous remission in a few patients. A combination of fluconazole and allopurinol has been found to be useful in some of the patients. A drug called arjun glucoside 1 has been found to be useful. It was tried by Tiagi et al. As far back as in 2005. May have some use, but we're not sure whether it's being marketed now for use. And of course, once they develop renal failure, they have to be offered renal replacement therapy. What about toxoplasmosis? In ordinary circumstances, may not cause any problem, may not have any link with kidney disease. However, in transplant patients on immunosuppression, you have a reactivation of dormant infection in these patients. And this has been reported, and it could be as high as 15% of transplant patients. Hydatid C is about Echinococcus granulosus infections and the kidneys. This is usually otherwise called duct tapeworm, can be acquired from contact with dogs, whether it's the food or water contaminated with dog feces. It's common in Australia, Argentina, Middle East, and in some parts of Africa. What really happens with Echinococcus infection? After ingestion of the larva, it encysts and penetrates in intestinal wall. Thereafter, it's conveyed to the liver and other organs via hematogenous spread. The slow-growing thick-walled cysts are formed in these organs, and that is what is usually responsible for the manifestation that they have, because they usually will cause obstruction. And urinary tract is involved in at least 3 to 5% of these cases. Patients may be symptomless, except if they are in the ureters, where they cause obstructive uropathy or recurrent urinary tract infection. May also predispose to nephrolithiasis, like you've known. You have an obstruction, you could have supersaturation, and you have precipitation of stones. And patients may present with loin pain or an hematuria. What are my conclusions? Glomerular disease, secondary to parasitic infections, are mostly immunologically mediated. Early disease are mild and sometimes self-limiting. Progressive disease may be secondary to yet unidentified factors. These days we are talking about APO1, MOH9 polymorphism, and the rest of them. We do not know their roles in these infections. Disturbed IgA kinetics may contribute to the immune derangements that are seen. What are the knowledge gaps? There's lack of adequate statistics, particularly on the prevalence of these problems. Are there diagnostic criteria for them? No. There's still no clear diagnostic criteria. So it's possible to say an entity does not exist. Do we have an idea of the specific nephrogenic strains of this parasite? Also no. Meaning that, and like you believe me, they won't come and look out for these ones for us. It's our responsibility as those in Africa, those that have this infection, to seek out for these things. What are the interactive effects of conditions like hepatitis B infection, salmonella infection, hepatitis C, HIV, malnutrition, and all that? They are also not recorded. It's an area that needs to be further explored. And we lack control trials. We say this treatment could be useful, that treatment could be useful, but there are no control trials to assess the efficacy of whichever treatment we have used. For those that did not respond to, we know. But there are so many new drugs these days that should be tried in some of these conditions. I acknowledge two of my mentors. Some of the slides I've used are their slides, Rashad Bassoum and A. Akinsola. Thank you very much.